Hello everyone, I'm excited to make this getting started tutorial about the use of the forest tools that you got on Fab, and you're probably wondering how do you get started with it. So first of all, what you should do is on the edit plugins, you should enable the PCG biome core, biome sample, PCG framework, external data interop, and geometry script interop. And once you restart the engine, you should see all of these things in here. Right now I'm just in the empty scene, the default one. Let's move it over here. Let's bring our first tool, and once we bring it in, you can see that nothing really happens, and that's because by default it has no idea what kind of surface you want to scatter on top of. So to fix that, in the global settings, O1 global, there's three options: landscape, spline, and static mesh. So if you check the landscape mesh and click generate, it'll execute the PCG for you, but since it's quite a large scene, it'll take some time. But you will have to wait for a long time for it to finish, because this is quite a large landscape and it takes quite some time to sample it. Now, there are ways to mitigate this, and in the next versions I'm gonna update the landscape to use HLSL as a means to mitigate the CPU dependency. So it'll spawn on GPU and will be a lot faster. But for now, if you have a large landscape, you can do the landscape mesh. Still, it'll just take a lot of time. So what you can do is you can either place a spline, or in the modeling tools you can just draw a spline. This tool works with any kind of splines. It doesn't have to be exactly this one, so if you have your own that you also need some tags in it or whatever, you can also use them. So I'm gonna move away and just gonna make my spline large enough. Let's say something like this. And I'm gonna pick the forest tool object and I'm gonna use the spline mesh. Now, it won't do anything right off the bat because you need to specify which spline you're gonna use it on. So in areas there's a splines category, and I'm gonna add to an array and pick the spline. And as you can see, it generates the meshes on top of it. Yeah, this is a huge landscape. So, but you can see there's a bit of a problem where some of the points are going beneath the landscape, so there's a checkbox for this in the areas. Under the splines there's project spline to landscape, and if you pick that, it'll place all of your points onto the landscape. kind of like so, but let me just make the density lower so that we won't wait as long. Let's say 10 times smaller. Yeah, okay. As you can also see, these meshes are not following the normals. And that's because, for the most part, if you're scattering, let's say, trees, you don't really want to follow the normal of the mesh. But for the grass, let's say, you want to follow the normals. So how do you do that? In the global section, there is a use normals direction. And if you check that, you can see that they updated to follow the normals. You can also see that some of them are larger, some of them are smaller, even though we are only using one mesh. And that's because under the transform, there is the transform mean and transform max. And by default, I placed it at -180 to +180 rotation and scale from 0.8 to 1.2 with the log scale as default. Now let's say you wanna filter them either by height or by slope. You can do this over here. Let's say maximum slope is gonna be 5. So it's right now it's everywhere except for the dimension that is higher than this. And high filtering, so let's say from 0 to 2, 0 to 5, 0 to 10, 30, 80, 200. Now this is about the filtering. You can also filter by materials, so you can write the name of your material on the landscape. Let's say you only want to scatter on top of the grass material, so you could just type here the grass and it'll only use that material in here. There's a distribution map. So essentially what distribution map means is that here under the textures there are several distribution maps for you to pick from, and it'll just sample the texture and cut off the points that are below the threshold, and it will create a much more believable and realistic behavior for your points. Let's say you want to do 0.1 instead, or maybe change the tiling to be different, and so on. For the clustering maps, let's go to global meshes and pick some more meshes to play around with. So I'm gonna duplicate this and I'm gonna pick the tree. I'm also gonna duplicate the tree and pick the cactus in here. So now we have 3 meshes. And they're all scattered kinda randomly, and usually the nature doesn't behave like that. That's why we have the in the under the distribution map, we have the clustering system. Now, if you just enable the clustering, it'll take the cluster size in meters squared and put the every 2 meters squared it'll put the cluster in there as a Voronoi pattern, basic Voronoi pattern. So if I turn off the distribution map, you can see that it kind of didn't change at all. But if we, let's say, do 200 in here, or maybe 500, you can immediately see how they are more clustered together. So if we do 1000, it becomes even more pronounced. And it'll update and adjust to any amount of meshes that you have in here. You can also visualize the clusters like so. So you can clearly see what you're doing, because sometimes you have way too similar of a geometry in here and it's kind of hard to see what you're doing with clustering. So if you choose the cluster map, it'll do basically the same as distribution map. It'll sample the map itself and put the geometry on their values. And I provided some base cluster maps for you, like these 4, and this one is just for the demonstration purposes. So you can see that it's a grayscale map, which means that each value from 0 to 1 is gonna be interpreted as a single cluster. So let's say if we use this, which only has 3 values, it'll only produce those values in here, as you can see. So we have a lot of cactuses, a lot of trees, and crosses in here, or multipliers. And you can again visualize it if you want to. This is about the clustering. Now let me just make the area a bit smaller so that we can do a lot more scatters in here and not wait for like several minutes to get the update of the tool. So now let's bump up the sampling to, let's say, 2. So now you can clearly see how many objects are in here, that it's, even if we get inside, it's just impossible to see what's going on. And let me just make it a little bit less. The amount of scatter points, because it's quite insane how many are there. Okay, now let's say you kind of went overboard like this, and you want to make sure that they're not bumping into each other. Like, trees aren't supposed to grow this dense next to each other or even become one like this. So there is a self-collision option for you to turn on if you'd like. And as you can see immediately, we are not bumping into each other anymore. And you can see what is going on more clearly. Of course, it's better to, for the optimization purposes and not to wait so long, it's better to use a lower sampling count. But if, let's say, you use the lower sampling count and it's still bumping into each other, next thing you're gonna do is, in the distribution map, turn on the self-collision, and you can play around with it, because sometimes, you know, you want the trees to be separated, but if they're too separated and you want the crowns of the trees to go into each other a little bit to create a more dense forest, let's say, you can just lower this by 0.7, let's say. Yeah, it's much better. So the distribution map again, and then let's say clustering. And you have this thing going. So to summarize, if you're having a huge landscape, you either use a very low sampling, like an extremely low amount, and work your way up from it, or you use the spline and then do the same. Now let's talk about the mesh. So let's say I have this plane in here and I want to scatter on top of it. I'm gonna bring in the same tool. As you can see, the bounding box here is quite large, and if you just choose the static mesh in here and click generate, it'll just use the collision, the world collision, to see where it's getting hit and spawn the point on top of that mesh, be it landscape, static mesh, whatever. So now how do you prevent it to, let's say, being scattered on the landscape? Well, first of all, what you can do in under areas, there's a scatter surfaces. So if you just add an element here and pick your plane, it'll only take into account that plane. So it'll use the extended bounding box of this plane to kind of shoot a ray from the top to see where it can place the point. As you can see in here. Now, with this method, there's also a little bit of a drawback, because if you have the same mesh kind of in here, let's say, or close to it. It sometimes, you see, it updated the position to be on top of that mesh, or all the way up in here. Just regenerate. It cannot see because the bounding box of this plane, well, first of all, it's a plane, so it doesn't have that much of a bounding box in here. But you can see that the world ray head cannot see the collision in here because it's bumping onto another plane over there. So now what you can do about that, you can go with the option under the global of poison sampling. And it's still somewhat an experimental feature, so it's sometimes gonna produce a result at 0 coordinate space. So if you stumble into this kind of situation, you can go and modify the extent of the bounding box. So let's say if I do 0.1 in here, and regenerate, you can see that it's not taking into account something that is not in the bounding box of this force tool. So you have 3 options to choose from. Next, let's say you want to scatter on top of something else. Let's use the sphere. In here, let's say the sphere is kind of this big. Let's put this over here. I'm gonna modify the bounding box a little bit. I'm gonna do the static mesh, go to the areas, delete this, and pick the sphere. So you can see it's scattering on top of it. Now let's say you want to use the normal direction. Let's say you want to add mass to a lot of your static meshes in this scene. You can still use the same thing. Use normal direction and it'll adjust to the normals of this static mesh. So we talked about this. Now let's adjust the position of this. Let's do maybe 5 meter sphere. Let's do another forest tool. And let's say forest spline. This is kind of somewhat big. So let's say you want to scatter on spline. So you're picking the spline there, you're picking the spline over here, and you're scattering. But you have the geometry in here that you want to avoid scattering beneath or on top or whatever. You can exclude this object. As a matter of fact, you can exclude also splines, or you can do an open spline in here. And you can, let's say you want to do the pass, kind of like so. So you're picking your FT tool and you're gonna exclude mesh under the mesh exclude in the area. You're gonna pick the sphere. Under the landscape spline exclude, you're gonna pick this spline, and under the spline open, because it's an open spline, you're gonna pick this one. And let's say this is not enough. You want them to avoid this mesh a lot more. So what you can do is you can play with the scaling. It'll just adjust the bounding box of this sphere, so the points will not generate closer to it. What you also can do is you can use the fall off from spline and fall off from mesh. There's a subcategory for the fall off. Right now you can see that the minimum scale they're gonna get is 0.4, and the distance of the fall off is 500 scene units, so 500 centimeters. You can invert fall off, so they will only spawn in the 500 units distance from those meshes. But in the case of mesh, you want to make sure that you have the lower mesh scale if you want them to actually follow that. So let's add more points so we can see it much clearer. So yeah, kind of like this. This is about the fall off, and if you choose the advanced mesh controls, it will just place a lot of different bounding boxes inside of this sphere that you can adjust, like the noise, the location of those bounding boxes, so that it'll randomly delete some points and will make it look like they are reduced by some sort of noise pattern in here. You can also use the landscape splines, so if you create in your splines from the landscape manager, let me just pick the spline and the spline in here. Kind of like so. Let's go with the less width to 200 centimeters. So you can see the landscape spline actor in here. So if you go to forest spline, first of all, forest tool. First of all, let me just delete the mesh, delete the spline, and delete the follow, so we can see what we're doing. Now, under the landscape spline, you're just gonna go ahead and pick the landscape spline actor. So you can just go here and just do landscape spline actor, and you can see that it's adjusted to the width of the spline. By the way, if you're using the forest splines, you can see that you also have the control over the scale of your spline. So let's say if you want this to be bigger and this to be smaller, the forest tool will also adjust to that. So if we're going to exclude open and pick this spline, you can see that if I'm adjusting it, it adjusts automatically. So this is about it. Thank you guys for watching, and see you next time in the next tutorial about the Forest tool. Thanks for watching and take care.